Michael Johnson had long been accustomed to the fact that everyone associated his father's name with money and great opportunities. The man himself couldn't boast of such achievements. He tried not to get too hung up on it and worked on gaining as much experience as possible. Michael was well aware of the cost of his father's success. He had to go through it a lot. There were wars with competitors who tried to steal his clients, and problems with tax authorities who preferred to fight their battles in courtrooms. It was only at the age of 50 that Donovan Johnson could finally relax and enjoy his life. Of course, it didn't mean that his life suddenly got easy and all the ill-wishers gave up on their attempts to ruin him. No, that definitely wasn't the case. But now, Donovan could rely on his son's help. Michael was already an adult. Moreover, he graduated from the Harvard Business School in Boston. With such a store of knowledge, Michael could become a worthy successor of his father, who had long been dreaming of retiring and doing something less troublesome with his life. Donovan knew that his son had what it took to run a successful business. But despite being a family, there were still some differences between Michael and his father. They were mostly manifested in the way they chose to do business. Michael didn't want to just take over control of the family business. Instead, he wanted to develop a new direction which would be independent of his father's money. Moreover, the young businessman was very involved in charity work, helping orphanages and support centers for people in difficult life situations. Donovan treated his son's charity work with understanding, since he believed that it was very important. However, when Michael told his father that he intended to leave Chicago and go on a kind of tour of the provincial towns of Massachusetts, the businessman's surprise knew no bounds. "Why would you want to do something like that? We already have enough business in our empire. We should work on developing them." Michael smiled mysteriously, after which he paused for a little and said, "Dad, I want to bring fresh blood into our business, to diversify our investment portfolio, so to speak. There are a lot of opportunities in small towns. For instance, we could buy out a factory and start making clothes, or we could buy a restaurant or cafe." Donovan Johnson thought about it for a little bit. There was definitely some truth to his son's words. He understood that the business needs continuous development and couldn't just remain as it was forever. "Well, if you like this idea so much, then you should go for it. I also started small back in the day, and it took me a while to find my place in the sun. Just keep me posted, okay?" Donovan said with a smile. Michael knew that his father would approve of this idea. He had long ago prepared a travel itinerary for those provincial towns with failing or bankrupt businesses or social facilities. Michael decided to start off with a week-long trip. He intended to rent out an apartment to stay at during his visit. Of course, Michael could have rented a hotel room, but then someone would definitely get wind of his arrival, and he wanted to avoid that. He took some clothes, loaded them into his brand new Ford, and left Chicago with the first rays of the sun. The man liked to start the workday as early as possible to make sure that he had enough time to do everything he had planned for the day. Finding an apartment to rent turned out to be even easier than he anticipated. Having brought a newspaper, Michael found the ads for the rental property and marked the ones he liked. Having arrived at the first address, the man couldn't help but feel disappointed. The house was in an awful state. His second attempt, however, turned out to be successful. The owner of the house was an old woman of about 80, who, despite her age, retained clarity of mind and seemed very healthy. Rebecca Alvarez was renting out half of her house because it was simply too big for her. As soon as Michael came into the living room, he immediately realized that he wouldn't need to continue his research. The old woman's house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, and something that immediately made the young businessman very hungry. "I made roast chicken with pineapples and baked potatoes and lemon sauce," the old woman said, catching the guest's astonished glance. "The smell is divine. I'm sure it tastes just as amazing." "Is this your trick, to attract tenants by cooking something delicious?" Michael asked with a smile. Mrs. Alvarez smiled and led her guest into the kitchen. As it turned out later, the old woman used to work as a chef back when she was young, so she definitely knew her way around the kitchen. Oh, if only you could see it. It was a great restaurant. There was live music, dancing until you dropped, and the kitchen. The food was simply divine. They don't make it that way anymore. Most cooks can barely make a decent burger, Mrs. Alvarez added. At the mention of the restaurant, Michael perked up noticeably. The businessman immediately decided that he needed to find its owner. Meanwhile, Mrs. Alvarez continued to reminisce. It's clear from the old woman's eyes that she was tired of being alone all the time. But when Michael timidly asked about Mrs. Alvarez's family, the old woman's eyes literally lit up with joy. "Oh, you should see my granddaughter. Louise is very beautiful. She's a great cook. I'm nowhere near as good as she is." Michael looked at the woman with curiosity. Then he took the money out of his wallet and paid the old lady for 3 months. "That's too much. There's enough money here to pay for rent for a year." "It's okay. Just take it, please. I feel like I might stay here for a while. Although, if you keep feeding me like this, I might end up not being able to fit through the door." Michael laughed. Life in Mrs. Alvarez's house was simple and unhurried, which made Michael feel as if he went back into the past, to the times of childhood, and was paying a visit to his grandmother. During the day, the businessman explored the town and its environs for establishments that had gone out of business and needed major investments to reopen. Thus, Michael learned that in addition to the restaurant, there were several promising car shops, a semi-abandoned laundromat, and even a single furniture factory. However, Michael was most affected by the orphanage, which was clearly in dire need of renovations. Gray walls devoid of their former gloss, burnt tiles on the roof, and windows with peeling paint on wooden frames. The building's appearance alone made one feel sad and abandoned. "I should definitely pay this orphanage a visit. This place clearly needs some remodeling. I'm sure it would make the kids' lives better," Michael thought. Having conducted an independent assessment of the city's infrastructure, the businessman made his decision. He chose the restaurant. With a competent approach and some work, it could definitely become a profitable establishment. Rebecca Alvarez was sympathetic to Michael's work, and therefore she always tried to make a delicious breakfast for the man, so that he would have enough energy to last him the whole day. One day, Michael came home earlier than usual and found the old woman's granddaughter, Louise, in the kitchen. Mrs. Alvarez was making tea and was unspeakably glad to see Michael. "Oh, I'm sorry, am I interrupting?" Michael was embarrassed. But the old woman nearly forced the man to take a seat at the table, after which she brought him a huge piece of pie and said, "Here, take a bite, dear, and don't mind Louise. She's got a temper, but she doesn't bicker over nothing." Michael exchanged meaningful glances with Louise, after which they both started laughing. Michael laughed so hard that he almost choked on the piece of pie. "Oh, okay, calm down. Find something better to do than laugh at the old woman," Mrs. Alvarez grumbled jokingly. Talking to Louise, Michael couldn't help but feel a surge of sympathy for this sweet and very beautiful young woman. As it turned out, Louise Alvarez really was a great chef who could cook almost all the classic dishes of American and European cuisine. It just so happened that due to the lack of proper employment, the young woman was forced to cook burgers and hot dogs in a roadside eatery that mostly served bikers and truckers. Of course, Michael understood that finding a better job in a small town was virtually impossible. Michael and Louise chatted in the kitchen until it got dark outside, which was why Michael volunteered to escort the woman home. Looking meaningfully at the young people, Rebecca Alvarez advised them not to stay out too long, because she wouldn't be able to go to sleep until she knew that everyone got home safely. Both Michael and Louise greatly enjoyed their moonlit walk and even started hoping that their friendship could turn into something more. Of course, they didn't immediately rush into a relationship, but it was obvious that the young people were attracted to each other. Subsequently, Michael always planned his days in a way that allowed him to come home right when Louise was visiting her grandmother. They would make a great couple, Mrs. Alvarez whispered, seeing off her young guests. There was definitely some truth to the old woman's words. After all, she lived a long life and knew what she was talking about. Both Michael and Louise would never forget the night they started an intimate relationship. Raindrops were drumming on the roof of a cheap motel. The sound seemed to be reflected in the frantically beating hearts of the passionate young lovers. Everything happened rather spontaneously, although Louise and Michael had long understood that they could no longer remain just friends. It's hard to say how their relationship would have developed if one day Michael hadn't received a call from his father, who said that he was sick. "It doesn't seem like anything serious, but the doctors could be wrong. I'm running a fever and I have shortness of breath, and the partners from Cleveland are coming in," the businessman explained. Feeling worried for his father, Michael immediately left for Chicago. He told Louise that he would only be gone for a couple of days. "Don't worry, I'll be back before you know it." I'll just help my dad out, attend a couple of meetings." Michael hastened to reassure the young woman. But the reality turned out to be quite different. Donovan's health problems turned out to be much more serious than it seemed at first glance. He had to go to the hospital for about a month, which meant that his son had to take over the business in the meantime. It would seem that there was nothing wrong with that, and Michael could have invited Louise to join him in Chicago. Unfortunately, having plunged into the whirlpool of his new life, taking care of business and his father, Michael didn't even realize when the thoughts about the woman from the small provincial town gradually faded into the background. At first, the young businessman even wanted to quit everything and return to Mrs. Alvarez and her granddaughter. But then he realized that it wasn't a smart thing to do, and his life returned to normal. And then Michael met Diana. She immediately set her eyes on the promising young man. They met accidentally, and the young businessman didn't think it would lead to anything serious at first. It was just a business relationship that, under certain conditions, would never have crossed the bounds of decency. Nevertheless, Diana was fortunate enough to find herself in the right place at the right time. Having surrounded Michael with care and attention, she easily found the key to his heart. Frankly speaking, the young businessman didn't even understand when and how she started sharing his bed with Diana. Moreover, it definitely wasn't love at first sight. It was more like a temporary insanity. This kind of thing often happens when a relationship starts off with physical intimacy, before the couple even gets to know each other properly. Of course, Michael didn't forget about Louise and thought about her from time to time. He was really sad about the way the relationship ended. Having given Diana reason to believe that they were a couple, Michael could no longer return to Louise, since it would mean betraying Diana. Over time, Donovan Johnson recovered from his illness and could return to running the business. But Michael was already smitten with Diana, who was persistently pushing him towards marriage. The young businessman couldn't resist the insidious beauty, and 6 months after they met, he proposed to her. Although, frankly speaking, it was more of a forced decision than something he genuinely wanted to do. Michael was simply tired of catching Diana's ingratiating glances, as the woman was determined to marry the millionaire at all costs. 5 years had passed. A lot had changed in Michael's life during that time. First of all, it concerned the family business, which Michael was now in charge of. Donovan Johnson bought a house in Miami and started living the life of a millionaire recluse. At the same time, the old man never failed to remind his son that he wanted to live long enough to see his grandchildren, and that he'd rather it happen as soon as possible. Michael wasn't opposed to the idea of becoming a father, but Diana seemed to be in no hurry to take on such responsibility. "We still have time, dear. Let me live a little for myself. I'm only 25. I'm not ready to deal with all those diapers and midnight feedings," the woman said. Michael didn't like confrontations, and therefore he tried to avoid them at all costs, especially in his family life. Frankly speaking, he'd long been disappointed in Diana, who turned out to be just a beautiful doll with long legs and nothing more. Having finally gotten what she wanted, the young woman started living the rich life she always dreamed of, spending her days in beauty salons and restaurants and changing cars to match the color of her numerous handbags. One day, after returning home from work earlier than usual, Michael heard strange voices coming from the bedroom. Having come closer, Michael started listening and nearly fainted from shock. There was a strange man in his bed. He was smiling languidly and talking about all the things he would do after he became a millionaire. "Be patient, I'll definitely think of something. I just got the address of a psychic in Milwaukee. Apparently, she's great at making all kinds of potions. A person who drinks is supposed to die of a heart attack in 48 hours, and the best part is that it doesn't even leave a trace," Diana said, unaware that Michael was listening in on their conversation. "Just deal with it already. I've been hearing nothing but promises from you for a whole year. I need you to do something. I'm tired of all the empty talk about love and a happy future together," the handsome young man said, sounding irritated. At that moment, Michael understood everything. He burst into the bedroom like an angel of retribution and threw Diana out into the street. And then her half-naked lover, too. "Don't even try to sue me. You're not getting a cent from this divorce. I'll hire the best lawyers, and they won't have a problem proving that you have had an affair. You must have been blinded by love and forgotten that we have cameras all over the house. Fortunately for you, there aren't any in the bedroom. but there is some in all the other rooms. I haven't looked at the footage in a long time, but now I'll definitely do it," Michael said in parting. Feeling awful, the businessman locked himself in his study and sat there until the morning. Looking to cheer himself up, Michael decided to do something that always made him happy and gave him a ton of positive emotions. It was charity work. Doing good things for someone else always had a magical effect on the man. By a strange coincidence, Michael chose the very orphanage, which was located in the hometown of Luis Alvarez. Of course, the businessman had no illusions about the prospects of seeing Luis again and simply wanted to help the little orphans. Having arranged for a visit with the management of the orphanage, Michael knew that the kiddos would be waiting for him like Santa on Christmas night. Everything happened just as the businessman expected. By his arrival, the kiddos put together a talent show and prepared a festive program with all kinds of games and competitions. After giving the kiddos their gifts, Michael proposed to renovate the building and install a new playground to replace the old one that was falling apart. The man was about to leave the orphanage when suddenly he saw a boy of about 5 who was standing at the door holding a chocolate bar in his hands. His face seemed vaguely familiar to Michael, but when the millionaire came closer, he could hardly hold back a surprised cry. "Dear God, this little boy looks exactly like I did at that age. He even has the same mole above the upper lip, which the other kids always teased me about. He has the same eye color and the same shape of the nose," flashed through Michael's head. The businessman's surprise was so sincere that the employees of the orphanage who were standing nearby felt out of place. "Where did this boy come from? Was he abandoned? What's his name?" Michael asked the director. The man was about to answer, but then a woman came from behind Michael and answered instead of the director. "My son's name is Liam, Michael. I didn't think you'd ever come back." The man shuddered and turned around, already knowing who he would see there. It was Luis Alvarez, smiling joyfully at the businessman. She was wearing an orphanage uniform and a characteristic chef's hat on her head. "So this is your son?" Michael said, surprised by the sound of his own voice. At that point, the orphanage employees deliberately stepped aside to let the young people talk in private. Luis nodded and then added, "He's your son too, Michael. You disappeared back then, and I only found out that I was pregnant a month after you left. Fortunately, my grandmother helped me raise Liam, and now I work as a cook here, feeding the kiddos, so to speak, and Liam helps me do it." Michael turned pale and started feeling dizzy. His hand involuntarily reached for his tie. "But why didn't you tell me sooner? After all, I could have helped you, you know? You could have moved to Chicago. I'm a wealthy man after all," Michael started to say, but then stopped mid-sentence. He understood that none of what happened was Luis's fault. He understood that if he hadn't left for Chicago back then, everything would have been different. On the other hand, Liam needed a father, whom he never once saw before. Michael picked up the boy, looked into his heavenly blue eyes, and started weeping softly. So much time had been wasted, and now he had a chance to make things right. Louise came over and put her hand on Michael's shoulder. "Welcome home, dear," the woman whispered and kissed him on the cheek. At the sight of such a beautiful couple, the staff of the orphanage couldn't hold back their tears. Michael took Louise and Liam by their hands and headed for the exit. Michael's car was parked in front of the building, and now the man intended to use it to take Louise and their son to the best place on earth, Disneyland.